want to give a shout out to Chris Hibbert, also a member of our board, who is serving as our producer and technical advisor. And so now we'll start with a panel, and I'm going to start with our writers, Wilson and Hoyt. The Prometheus Award encourages writers to explore political and philosophical ideas about freedom, self-ownership, non-aggression, and individual rights. Is there something about science fiction that lends itself to exploring these kinds of ideas?
Yeah, well, with science fiction, you can determine the background. You can, against which you're going to set your characters. And it doesn't have to be, you don't have to adjust to the real world. You can make another plausible world where the conditions allow you to make those comparisons and to make the plot points that will illustrate. I mean, for me, I don't like to have it too, I mean, libertarianism is my worldview. I try desperately not to preach when I write, but it does seep through. But I think it's more effective if it does just seep through, that you're not preaching to the reader. You're sort of showing them, this is how maybe it could be. I'm not telling you you've got to agree with me, but just to trigger a little thought. Yeah, is all that government necessary? I mean, here's a guy who lives without it and has to work around it. He doesn't seem like such a bad guy, and that's the sort of thing that can lead readers to explore different ideas. Because when I started writing science fiction, I chose a blatantly libertarian future, mainly because no one else was doing that. And to me, it was an alien philosophy to most people who were raised in America and educated in the American system. So I said, well, I'm going to be writing about some aliens. Why not also have an alien philosophy at work here? And all of a sudden, I won this award that I didn't know anybody was noticing. For me, I was doing it for myself because I thought this would be a cool way to structure a future. And yes, it could be like this. And then I was recognized, and it was a great honor, and it was a tremendous pleasure to find out I wasn't alone.
Go ahead, Sarah. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
I know. I seem to have turned into the invisible woman. I also managed to do online my trick of always arriving late for a panel, which you must admit was a new one. I might intermittently show up since it's apparently trying to detect the camera. I presume we're doing introductions.
We've gone through that, and I'm going to repeat the question that
Thank you.
Paul just answered. We encourage writers with our award to explore political and philosophical ideas, including about freedom, of course, individual rights. Is there something about science fiction that lends itself to exploring ideas?
I believe so. It's almost impossible for us to write a future without projecting our ideas of what that future will look like. I mean, I suppose I could put myself into an utterly alien mindset, but not only would it be very hard, but if you go too far down that path, you risk your readers not understanding you. It reminds me of when someone asked why I had some alien sentences, but had neglected to apparently write the entire book in the alien language. And I had to point out I'd be perfectly willing to do that, but no one would be able to read it. So I think it's the same sort of thing. It's really hard for us to create the future without going with our innate assumptions. I mean, yes, it's possible for me to create a future where I deviate somewhat from what I believe. What do I mean? I don't necessarily write about the world as I believe it should be, but the way I create the characters, the way people react, the way gambits work out in the real world, I'll have to go back to what I've experienced, what I believe, what I think even subconsciously. So ideas will be explored in science fiction because we are creating a future history, and we're not a hive mind. Each of us has different ideas. Even if we tried really hard not to explore any new ideas, an idea that I consider, oh, of course it's this way, will be absolutely shocking to someone out there. So, of course, science fiction explores ideas because we explore the future, and that right now only exists in our minds.
Thank you, Sarah. And Bill, I have a question for you. Since you're the chairman of our Hall of Fame nominating committee, people sometimes are surprised by the works that we give awards to, and Lord of the Rings by J.R. Tolkien seems to be a case in point. To me, it seemed obvious why we gave an award to that, but apparently it's not obvious to a lot of people. Can you explain that award?
Well, I was going to start out by saying it seemed obvious to me, just as you did. I mean, here is a novel that is about a ring of power, one ring to rule them all. And what does Tolkien show us about that ring? Well, he shows us first that it's a danger to the world. It enables its possessor to conquer and enslave the free peoples, to go out and subjugate people and rule them according to his unique vision of how things should be, with no input from anyone else. But also he shows us through other characters that the ring is dangerous to have, that it is corrupting, that it would, Gandalf and Galadriel both dread the thought of having the ring because it would tempt them to use their power in ways that would destroy them. Faramir says that he would not pick up this thing if he found it by the side of the road. And we see that it has a steadily corrupting influence on Frodo, and in a sense that Frodo and Gollum are spiritual twins. Gollum is what Frodo is in danger of becoming. And Tolkien shows us that it is addictive, that the drive to power is addictive. And I am baffled that people read this and don't get the libertarian theme out of it myself, but I think part of it is that people look at this in terms of too much of the present, that they do not think in terms of the mindset that Tolkien was looking at. Tolkien is thinking in terms that came from Catholicism, and that before Catholicism went back to Aristotle. The idea that there can be a good king or a bad king, a king or a tyrant. There can be a good minority, the aristocracy, or a bad one, the oligarchy. There can be good rule by the majority, or there can be bad rule by the majority, which Aristotle called democracy. And in each case, the good ruler is the one who rules as a trustee, exercising his power for the good of the whole society, not just of himself or his faction, but for the good of everyone. And the bad ruler says, no, I'm the boss. You're going to do the things the way I want to do. And we see that same thought in Madison's writings about the Constitution, where he warns about the danger of either a minority or a majority having power. And he says a faction that is a majority is the biggest danger, because they will rule on behalf of the majority interest against the minority. And certainly in his time, you had the issue of slavery, which was very much the white majority oppressing the black minority. So, and that kind of thing, that kind of thought is different from thinking about the majority rule or the people rule. It's a more fundamental difference in Aristotle's view, and it's something that Tolkien was thinking of. The question is not only does the one or the few or the many rule, the more fundamental question is who are they ruling for? Are they ruling for the whole under the law, or are they ruling for themselves without regard for the law? And we see that very much we've seen people protest against Aragorn because he's a king, but Aragorn seeks the consent of the people of Gondor before becoming their king. And he is clearly somebody who intends to rule under the law. And that is a profoundly libertarian idea, that the rulers and the state should be under the law and not be a power in their own right. And I think that is why we gave the award to Tolkien.
I'm glad you explained it so clearly, because I wouldn't want people to think we simply tried to grab a famous book and impose our award on it. I think you explored pretty well why we did that. But now I have a question for Michael. Our award, in a sense, recognizes an intersection between science fiction and libertarianism. And we've been giving it every year for 40 years, and we've never had a year where we had to tell our members, gee, we can't find any libertarian-themed science fiction works. You don't have anything to vote on today, knock on wood. Michael, why do we have so many intersections between science fiction and libertarianism?
Well, first I should mention we do have sort of no award, none of the above is an option on our ballot. And in the 1980s, there was one year where we had nominees and finalists, but the members of the organization decided that there shouldn't be a winner that year. So that's a possibility. But to answer your question, it's interesting to me that the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction itself recognizes that strong connection. In the Libertarian SF category, the listing in the encyclopedia refers to it as a major strand in science fiction. The listing goes on to say that more than any other social or political movement, libertarianism itself emerged in the 1960s and 1970s and expanded in the 1980s. Of course, we're in a dark period now of authoritarianism on the left and the right, so this is not a great decade for freedom, unfortunately. But it developed through people reading fiction, and that's really unusual in history of social and political movements. Now, we all know a lot of the most famous novels that turned on a lot of people to the fact that, oh, I already am feeling that way, or they introduced them to new ideas. I started off growing up as a Jewish liberal Democrat with a father from an ACLU attorney, and it was quite a change for me to read books like Robert Heinlein's The Moon and Harsh Mistress and some of his other novels, Strangers in Strange Land, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and Anthem, L. Neil Smith, later on reading his The Probability Brooch, or Jane Neal Schulman's Alongside Light. These are among the libertarian SF classics that became bestsellers and turned on a lot of people to the ideas of libertarianism. But the interesting question is, why did it take fiction to help spur the most popular libertarian movement in America since the mid-1800s, when the libertarian abolitionist movement succeeded in paving the way for the end of slavery? I think it's because when you have something that people have viewed for centuries around the world as a necessary evil, whether government is a necessary evil, tyranny, or slavery. Remember, slavery has been universal throughout all cultures, and people of every race, religion, and ethnicity and nationality have enslaved people of every other race and religion and nationality. Why did it last for so long? Because people, when they grow up in a particular world, a family, a country, we tend to accept the status quo. We think, well, I don't like this. Gosh, I don't like it when this has this horrible consequence. But they can't imagine the alternative. Fiction helps us imagine an alternative, and science fiction is the literature of ideas and possibilities, can really help us imagine a freer future a future without slavery, a future without coercive government, a society that might be more fully embodying civilized ideals of respect for each other's rights, cooperation, rather than the institutionalized coercion of the unbridled state.
It seems like when we have a discussion like this, it's only going to go so long before we bring up Robert Heinlein, who has won 7 Prometheus Awards, more than anybody else. So I'm going to ask our 2 writers, Paul and Sarah, how has Heinlein influenced your writing?
Do you wish to go first, Paul?
Go.
Okay.
I'm messing with the camera still.
Well, the thing that struck me, I really didn't take Heinlein. I mean, I never found anything objectionable in his fiction, but I didn't really glom onto a story of his that was really set my juices flowing with until I read A Moon and Harsh Mistress. I thought that is probably, for me, that is his pinnacle. As an influence, his future history was, I think, the biggest influence on my science fiction. It was that from the very beginning, I decided I would have a future history like Heinlein had. Before I even read that he had a future history, I would be reading his stories, and you would have a character or an event from another story be mentioned in passing. And that was it was a thrill. I was like, hey, I know what he's talking about. I've read that story. And, oh, these people, they're and that added, to me, it added such, a short story is a snapshot in a way. But it adds depth to those short stories because they're connected. And then you want to find another story that's connected to those 2. And then when you find that third, you want to find the fourth. And I realized that this is a wonderful way to build a readership, but it's also a way to build a future, because isolated short stories don't do too much to build. They're not expansive in world building. Whereas when you have them all linked, all of a sudden that future takes on a 3rd dimension, and even a 4th dimension, because you can see things developing over time. So that was his biggest influence on me. But when I read The Moon and the Harsh Mistress, I realized you could have a libertarian themed novel, and even for someone who didn't get the very basic libertarian ideas behind NASFiC, it's still a great story. So you can tell a great story, have these libertarian themes, and someone who is tone deaf to your nuances there still has a great time and thinks they've gotten their money's worth. So that was an eye opener.
Sarah, I know you love Heinlein, so I'm going to ask you to go ahead and weigh in, even if we can't see you.
Even if I'm invisible, this is really disturbing me. I was trying to connect my son's camera. It also doesn't work. And it's annoying because it's just Zoom. All the other apps see the camera. So I guess Zoom decided to save me the embarrassment of showing my face. My experience with Heinlein is probably unique because, as I mentioned before, I was born and grew up in Portugal, and my family is still there. So this wasn't, culturally, this wasn't a situation of Americans living abroad and raising a child abroad. I was Portuguese. And my first reaction to Heinlein books was annoyance, including the first time I read The Moon's a Harsh Mistress, because so much of it seemed to be so strange. What's the point of objecting to paying taxes, which he made jokes about in several books? I mean, everyone pays taxes. That's the way it is. That's the way it's always been. And I can't identify when my mind started to change. I just know I started reading him when I was 12 or 13. And by the time I was 20, it didn't seem strange. It seemed more like, oh yes, that makes sense. Finally, something that makes sense. And he became not just the most important influence on my writing, but possibly on my life in many ways. I don't think I'd be here, and I don't think I'd be a writer without Heinlein. When I first started to get serious with my husband, I handed him a pile of Heinlein books and said, read this or we can't see each other anymore. And he did. So our firstborn is named Robert Hansen. He was born on the 7th of July, but that's just a coincidence. He started being born on the 4th. So, and it's like Paul, I also felt the compulsion to write a future history. I'm not absolutely sure what it says about me that I now have 3 that have no points of contact between them. But the Dark Ship Thieves, the winner of the 2011 award, was in fact the first result of that future history. It's set solidly in the future history. And yes, I did that because I thought I had to. Heinlein did it. So.
I think CJ Cherry and Jane Fancher are still with us, so if you want to turn on the camera and answer that question too, you're welcome to. I read a science fiction novel, Footfall, by Larry Niven and Jerry Pournelle years ago, in which Robert Heinlein and CJ Cherry both appear as thinly disguised characters. So if you guys want to jump in and weigh in, please do so.
Well, when I talk to you, basically what I was thinking is that the way that Heinlein affected me, much as Sarah said, I read him when I was young, and I started reading him when I was very young. And his thoughts infiltrated my brain the same way that my libertarian brother's notions infiltrated my brain. So it became a part of what I accepted as how the world should work, as far as the freedoms and free trade and so forth go on. But I think that within the scope of books, one of the things that is interesting as a writer is that rather than writing a quote libertarian book, which is not a problem. They're wonderful ones. I read Atlas Shrugged many years ago, and of course Heinlein's and everything else. But one of the things that the way that it was worked into and is worked into all of our literature is that it's an ongoing alternative to other methods, and so that you can use it just to sort of infiltrate the same way with any other societal elements. You can use them as, and of course, this is the way it works. And that's really all I wanted to say, is that it can be done a little more subtly than just writing a book that is like Atlas Shrugged is the one I can point to the most thoroughly. But anyway, that's really all I wanted to say. And Sarah basically said it for me, so I didn't need to be here anyway.
We're glad you're here.
And CJ Cherry, just for the benefit of the rest of us, will never appear as a character in somebody else's novel. What was it like to be in Footfall? Was it annoying? Was it flattering?
Oh, I can say it was a surprise. No, I had the pleasure of knowing Robert Heinlein briefly, and I very much enjoyed the meeting, but I honestly never planned to figure in a novel. I will say that as far as the themes that we have worked with, the human freedom, the freedom to choose, the freedom to vote with your feet, and so on and so forth, I view that as a far more likely human future, being an optimist, than I do the Dark Lord of the Empire, or these other notions where we have abdicated all responsibility to somebody who will direct our lives. I don't think that's the way human beings tick. If you get one of those started, pretty soon there's a bunch meeting in the shadows to do something about it. And
well, the Roman legions who stopped at the edge of the territory sat down and said, "Give us a reason to go on."
Exactly.
It's not a totally new idea.
Historical incident. They were being asked to go to the south of Rome, and they reached the end of the Roman territory, and they plunked right down in the middle of the road and made their commander explain where they were going and why. And I think
I have faith in human character, and I think basically we want to do our own thing.
Right. So at any rate,
we'll kind of let you go on. It's been fun listening in, but you guys have a wonderful thing going, and I don't want to interrupt anymore. Yeah. So we'll just go on listening.
All right. Thank you, ladies. And Paul, I saw you raise your hand. Did you have something you wanted to add?
I was scratching my head.
All right. Well, we're going to put you to work again, Paul. A question for both Paul and Sarah, and it is a question suited for CJ Cherry too. How has winning awards, the Prometheus Award and others, affected your career, or did it affect your career?
Well, I could start off, and I would say, if it had an effect, it was an indirect effect. One of the fallout was that I started hearing myself referred to as that libertarian science fiction writer, which I wasn't too pleased with. Not because I was worried about the libertarian designation, but I was concerned about being put in a box, and which is something that for me is it's a straitjacket. I didn't want people to, every time they open one of my books, to expect something that was libertarian. I'm a genre hopper. And I think Sarah is as well. And we genre hoppers, we need our freedom, to go where we want to go and do what we want to do. And so that actually spurred me into moving into horror, which was another one of my loves. I had two big loves growing up. One was horror and one was science fiction. And I started off in science fiction because there was no market for my horror, even though the first story I ever started was the Campbell, and it was called Rat Man, and it has a fellow who winds up being eaten alive by these mutated rats. I don't know why I thought I would send it to Campbell, but he bought it. But that was where my horror roots were. Also, if you read the Terry, which was published as part of Binary Stars, at one point, Jim Franco said, "You've got enough horror in here. Now let's tone it back." So I went and wrote The Creed, and which was a career-changing book. So in a sense, I have to thank the Prometheus Award for, in a sense, pushing me to move into a different genre, and and so I wrote horror fiction all through the '80s and into the '90s until it had experienced that huge bust. But other than that, the Prometheus Award was what was the spur that sent me into a different genre.
Sarah?
I think it had a greater effect on me than on most people receive it, simply because I was still fairly obscure. Partly because not only am I a natural genre hopper, but I came in at the time when publishers seem to want you to move into something else. So I hadn't built much of a following, even though at the time I had, I think, 3 series that were pretty much dead-ended. And when I got the Prometheus Award, and I talked to other people who have received it and said, well, I didn't notice any difference, but I noticed a very marked difference in that all of a sudden, all sorts of people who had never heard of me were reading the book. And so to me, it was a huge boost to my career. I'm such a weird collection of background, and most people, the first time they actually hear me speak, I've had people who have read me for years, and because we're all online, I join in the meeting or something, and I hear, "Whoa, you have an accent." and because they assume I was raised aboard in an American base, not as a foreigner. And so, there are people who put me in all sorts of boxes of their own making anyway. And the boxes are so contradictory that the only way they keep me there is if they really want to. And who am I to tell them they can't? But probably the worst boxes were from the publishing establishment itself, who kept telling me that my one authentic novel had to be Portuguese, which made me question their sanity, because I left there permanently at 22, but before that I was in and out since 17. So I have no experience of being an adult in the culture, which is extremely hard. It would be easier to write about it as a complete foreigner having studied it than as someone who grew up there and now has no clue what's going on most of the time. We had the weird experience of being lost in the backwater in the mountains, my husband and I, and we couldn't figure out which place was the restaurant. There's always one, might be a tavern or something, but there were no signs, and I could no longer read the context. So, my husband was going, "You have to know where this is." I'm going, no, and we might end up barging in someone's living room. I have no idea. So we stayed hungry until we drove someplace that actually had signs. But I'm that alien. So, and at the same time, I remember things from when I was a kid, which, like all kids, might be mistaken. So it was actually not really something I could do, but they were convinced, because I guess I'm genetically Portuguese and was born and raised there. That was the only novel I should write. And I found that an incredibly restricting box telling me, this is the only one that will be authentic. So other than that, boxes don't bother me. Sometimes people assume things and then they get over it. It's fine.
CJ Cherry, this is a chance for me to find out if something is true. Is it true that when you got your first Hugo Award, you responded by quitting your day job?
Actually, I had already quit my day job. I was a school teacher, Latin and ancient history. And John Wollheim, bless his heart, wrote to me, and when I can't even remember what letter actually prompted it, but I'd written to him, and then he wrote back to me and he said, all right, here's an advance on, I forget how many books it was. I think it was 3.
3 is what you always told me.
Yeah, I think it's 3. And quit your job and write. And I just said, gulp, this is more than I make in a year. I think I can survive. And now I just have to write 3 books.
Nobody is probably worse paid than Oklahoma teachers.
Well, there is that. But at any rate, I did quit at that point. And by the time I did win my first Hugo, that
was Cassandra?
That was for Cassandra. Yeah, that was a short story, which I would occasionally spin off now and again. If a story just wants to be written, it has to be written right then, especially if it's a short story. So I did, and that one, yeah, it worked. But
did you notice an increase in readership after you?
Well, I'll tell you, the one thing that the Hugo or any award does is the publisher immediately plasters it on the cover of your next book. Award-winning author, whatever have you. And that will prompt somebody who's never read to pick up the book and at least give it a look. And that helps immensely. As science fiction writers, we don't get big publicity. We don't have the huge ad campaigns or whatever. So we take what we can get, and those awards do help. They help us a lot.
Well, Bill and Mike, you've been coasting, so we're going to put you to work again. How do you, as long-time Prometheus Award administrators and judges, how do you feel about the Prometheus recognizing dystopian works as opposed to recognizing books that advance positive ideas, such as this year's winner, Alliance Rising?
Well,
I'd like, Bill, I'd like to start if I could. I agree that positive visions are great, such as the way that Alliance Rising shows how people, flawed as they are, working in an interstellar future on different colonies, can reduce the threat of conflict and war through free markets. That's very positive. But I don't think that dystopian views are negative. I think if they're insightful and compelling, they show us the horrors of tyranny and slavery, or the progressive decline of a civilization through increasing abuses of power and expansion of power. And I think that's very libertarian in showing the truth of the great British Catholic liberal historian, Lord Acton, who said, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I'm very glad that we have an honored and necessary place in our roll call of Prometheus winners for such classic dystopian works as Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, Anthony Burgess's A Clockwork Orange, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged and Anthem, Ira Levin's underestimated This Perfect Day, which imagines sort of a therapeutic state with medication as the sort of a soft tyranny. And I wish that's the one Ira Levin book that's not been made into a movie. It would make a great film. Alan Moore and David Lloyd's graphic novel V for Vendetta, and also Ursula Le Guin's more complex and somewhat dystopian comparison of socialist and capitalist models on two rival planets in The Dispossessed. So I love dystopian literature because of the negative lessons it teaches us, which I view as positive.
Okay, I'm going to say something slightly different, which is, but most basically, yes and no. dystopian fiction as such is not necessarily libertarian or relevant to libertarianism. There are dystopian novels that where you just have the idea of an awful society, a bad society that oppresses people, and it is a cliche now, in the same way that, for example, in the comic book stories, for a long time, you had this sinister corporation manipulating things, and the corporate villain became a cliche. You did not necessarily have any coherent vision of why the corporation was doing this or what led them down this evil path. You do not necessarily, in a dystopia, have an understanding of why they are going for this dystopian path. I think that some dystopias have a strong libertarian message, and the ones that have a new insight are worth honoring. I'm going to cite Joe Walton's series, Farthing Halfpenny and Half a Crown, which is set in an alternate history England, where basically a Nazi sympathetic government took over and declared peace with Germany. And it's not hardcore dystopian. They're basically cozy murder mysteries when you come right down to it. But it is a very grim society. But the interesting thing about it is the insight into the moral corruption of in this case, a police officer, a detective, who is trying to work in a dark, oppressive society, and showing what compromises he makes and how he is tempted to betray his own sense of integrity. That is a source of insights, and I think a dystopian work can be that. And that is also relevant to libertarianism in an interesting way. But it depends on the dystopia. I think that is what I have to say. Some dystopias are very formulaic and cliched, and some dystopias are insightful and have something new to say. And those are the ones that deserve recognition.
I agree.
I want to add a minor bit of literary history, by the way, to something that Paul said a while ago about The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Some years ago, we gave Werner Vinge a Lifetime Achievement Award. And during his acceptance speech, he talked about his novels, especially The Peace War and Marooned in Real Time, being influenced by David Friedman's libertarian book, The Machinery of Freedom. And Friedman, who was in the audience and had come down for the presentation, turned around and talked about how he had been inspired to start thinking about his model of anarcho-capitalism and his concept of a free society by reading The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. So there you have a nice little bit of inspirational thing that Heinlein did. He was an influence on Vinge at second hand.
And of course, we've given the Prometheus quite recently to Travis Corcoran novels that obviously are influenced by The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. And Ian MacDonald arguably might have been influenced by that in his acclaimed Luna books, which were on the Hugo ballot this year. Another question for our writers. Both of you have created long-running series. If you go to F. Paul Wilson's website, repairmanjack.com, you can see how many of his works are tied to his Secret History of the World. And of course, all of us have read Sarah's Dark Ship series and her series. Oh, hi, Sarah. We see you now. And of course, C.J. Cherry and Jane Fancher just won for a book that returns to the Alliance universe. Why do writers do that, tend to write fiction as part of this series? And are there going to be any more Repairman Jack or Dark Ship or Alliance universe books?
Yes.
Yes.
And because it's a lot of work to make that universe.
Not only that,
So you may as well use it. You've built the universe and it's there to be explored. Is that part of the answer?
Star has a story, and there's a whole lot of them out there.
And Carolyn wrote in that universe for years without addressing this, with only alluding to this underlying
what was going on with the
economic
merchant
theme that we're
regime.
dealing with
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And it's a lot of work. We talked about doing a new universe, we even talked about doing a YA book, but it's a lot of work to do that. And she had it just sitting there with all these holes in it.
I've got a notebook you wouldn't believe. Things an inch thick.
So anyway, that's our answer. lots still to explore.
Is Repairman Jack on strike until the Repairman Jack movie comes out? And when does the Repairman Jack movie come out? And then we'll let Sarah answer.
Repairman Jack movie, probably right after Godot.
I got briefly excited. I'm sorry.
I probably have done the last Repairman Jack book. Although, I mean, if something appeals to me, I'll do it. With Jack, the main attraction I had with Repairman Jack was that it allowed me to genre hop within the series. So I've always annoyed the marketing department by switching to something else. Once they say, "Oh, you just built up an audience here. Now you're going to do this," and I say, "Yeah, because that's the next book." And so with Jack, they were happy because I could write a ghost story. I could write a conspiracy novel. I could write a high-tech novel. I could write a medical thriller. And as long as Jack is the protagonist, they know how to market it. And so it made everybody happy. I mean, the readers were happy for the variety. The marketing department was happy because they knew what to do. Editor was happy because we were selling. So, I mean, for that, it was a great solution for me. But I didn't want to the dirt. That's what I was afraid of. You know, it got to the point where the weight of all the books got to the point where I figure I have to end it. I have to stop it now. Otherwise, I'm going to wind up like Robert B. Parker's Spencer, where, you know, you pick up a Spencer book in the later years and you say, "I've read this already," and he was just repeating himself. So I don't want to do that. You know, Jack's too important to me. So I'd like to go out on a high note. Sarah?
First, I discovered Repairman Jack by accident because I got a free book. It was Hosts at that convention. And I still attribute this to an act of fate because I was sorting the books I was going to take on the plane to read on the plane. This was pre-Kindle, so you know that the anxiety of being in the air and all of a sudden you don't have reading material. And I looked at the cover and I thought, well, looks more like a thriller. I don't really want to read that right now. And I swear I put it in checked luggage. However, when I got on the plane and I realized the book I had selected to read was just not to my taste, I started looking through the bag and there it was. So I read it on the way to Colorado. And by the time we landed, it was pretty late. Before going to bed, I went up to my office and ordered the rest of the series from Amazon, which back then was brand new.